Afternoon, everybody. Thanks for sticking around or coming in. My name is Michael Beatie, and I'm presenting my capstone, which is titled El Béisbol Latinoamericano, or Latin American Baseball, Reflections of a Region. My capstone discusses the history of baseball in Latin America as a reflection of the region in Latin America where it's most prominent. After an introduction, I'll discuss two distinct eras within Latin American baseball. The first is from 1847 to 1947, the arrival of the game and the development of the game in Latin America. And the second era is from 1947 to the present, in which we see a wave of Latin players coming to the United States to play baseball. And through their actions and anecdotes, we see how baseball in Latin America reflects the region. The game of baseball is traditionally associated with the United States. I actually ran into a little bit of resistance on doing this topic since it's such an American game, traditionally speaking. Its fictional history credits an American soldier with the invention of the game in Cooperstown, New York, where the U.S. Baseball Hall of Fame is located. The truth about the game, though, is that it's not really unique to the United States. It has origins in the British game of rounders and cricket, and it has an ever-growing presence on foreign soils. Today, the highest level of play takes place in Major League Baseball in the United States. 31 of 32 teams are actually in the United States. The other team is in Toronto, Canada. At the beginning of the 2005 season of Major League Baseball, nearly 1 in every 3 Major League Baseball players was born outside of the 50 United States. With the occasional exception of an Australian, Asian, or Canadian player, almost all players who are foreign-born come from Spanish-speaking Latin America. In the U.S. minor leagues, the farm system for Major League Baseball, the number of Latinos is even greater. In 2004, 43% of all 6,200 minor league baseball players were from Latin America. Dominicans actually outnumbered all other groups other than American-born players. In the major leagues, some of the best and brightest players last year were Latinos. Johan Santana, the Venezuelan pitcher from the Minnesota Twins, won 20 games and won the Cy Young Award. The Cy Young Award is given to the most valuable pitcher in his respective league. Vladimir Guerrero, a Dominican outfielder, won the MVP award, the most valuable player award in the American League. The closer from Panama of the New York Yankees continued to be one of the best pitchers in all of baseball, and he recorded his 300th save. And Carlos Beltran, then of the Kansas City Royals and Houston Astros, a Puerto Rican, became the most sought-after free agent at the end of last season for his efforts last year. This year, he'll make over $11 million playing for the New York Mets. And last year, in Houston, yeah, pays a little bit better than picking coffee. Last year in Houston, Texas, 24 of the 64 Major League All-Stars were Latinos. They represented the Dominican Republic, Venezuela, Puerto Rico, Mexico, Colombia, Panama, and certainly not least, Cuba. Facts like these led me into my research project. I've played baseball and watched baseball for as long as I can remember. And watching programs like Baseball Tonight on ESPN or picking up a sports page, it's easy to see that Latin baseball players are prominent in U.S. major leagues. And I was able to infer that at the very least the game was popular enough in Latin America to develop a lot of really good players. The focus of my research was actually in how Latin American baseball, historical and contemporary, reflects Latin America. When I talk about Latin America, what we're really talking about is a region within Latin America, the north of Latin America. And as shown by this map, baseball's spread and influence is limited to the countries in green: Colombia, Venezuela, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Nicaragua, Panama, regions of Mexico, which I'll explain in a minute, and the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico. I've read and heard a lot of suggestions that baseball outside of the United States, and Latin America in particular, is the direct result of U.S. military occupation. However, in examining how baseball came to Latin America, what we find is that military presence and occupation in places like Mexico, Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Panama, and Nicaragua is only a little part of the story. In Cuba and Venezuela, this is just a list of military conflicts that took place in the region. In Cuba and Venezuela, Nicaragua college students brought the game to Latin America when they came home from studies in the United States. To talk about how the game got to Latin America, not only in Nicaragua and Venezuela and Cuba did the game come by way of students, it also came by way of other influences, particularly Cubans. It first arrived in 1864 in Cuba with a baseball player, or with a student named Nemesio Guillot. He came to Cuba with a bat and a ball, and they were the first that are documented as being brought to the island. In 1868, the 10 Years' War began between Spain and Cuba, and during the 10 Years' War, Cubans fled to the Dominican Republic, and with them they took their new enjoyment and passion for the game. In other places like Puerto Rico and Venezuela, the game showed up in other manners. In Puerto Rico, it showed up in 1890 with sailors from the United States and from Cuba, and the game's popularity was increased through the continued communication between Cubans and Puerto Ricans. And in Nicaragua, Panama, and Colombia, what we see is an influence of the United States' desire to develop a canal through Central America. So the game showed up in Panama as Americans trekked through Panama trying to continually map a route for a canal. Mexico is kind of an interesting case in terms of the development of the popularity of baseball, because in the history of baseball in Mexico, the states of Sonora, Sinaloa, Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, Veracruz, and Yucatan all lay claim to being the first places where baseball was played. Mazatlan is documented as one of the first places where the game was played, and the people who played the game were American soldiers. However, in Yucatan, Cubans brought the game to Mexico. As the game grew in popularity in Cuba, it went through all parts of society. It started out as an element of the aristocracy. It was adopted as a sort of revolt against Spanish culture in preferring signs of modernity. In 1868, the first baseball game in Cuba was played, and Havana beat Matanzas 51 runs to 9. Esteban Bellan was the first player to leave Latin America and play for a major league team in the United States. He played with the Troy Haymakers of Cincinnati just a couple of years after he was a member of one of the teams that played in that first game in Cuba. The first professional leagues that developed in Latin America developed in 1878 in Cuba, in 1907 in the Dominican Republic, and in 1925 in Mexico. The Mexican League at one point reached such popularity and strength that in the 1940s, the owner of the Veracruz Blues was offering salaries higher than what any American teams could offer, and the United States major leagues threatened American players with a lifetime ban if they left to play in Mexican baseball. this is Esteban Bellan, the first person to play for a major league team. Some of the important baseball players who kind of reflect what was going on in Latin American baseball are Irán Bithorn, Adolfo Luque, and Alejandro Carrasquel. Respectively, they're the first players from Puerto Rico. Probably the first really prominent player from Cuba, Adolfo Luque, whose nickname was Papa Montero, and Alejandro Carrasquel. Something we can note about them, if just by looking at them, they were all white players. To leave Latin America and play in the United States, baseball was still segregated until 1947, which is why the history is sort of divided between those two eras. The limitation of that made it so that players like Jose Mendez, Cristobal Torriente, and Pedro Perucho Cepeda were unable to play in the U.S. major leagues. They had the option to play in the Negro leagues during the modern era of segregation, but some of them, like Pedro Cepeda, actually elected not to play because they felt that it was they basically didn't approve of the discriminatory policies. In 1947, Jackie Robinson, an American, broke the modern color line with the Brooklyn Dodgers, and his act of breaking the color line actually ended up being the Dodgers, thanks, Ronaldo. His act of breaking the color line actually ended up opening the door for people of color from throughout Latin America, because before 1947, only white players were able to leave and play in Latin America. The door was open for players like Orestes, Mini Miñoso, the Alou brothers, Mateo, Felipe, and Jesus Alou, who in the 1960s actually comprised an all-Alou outfield for the San Francisco Giants. All three of them played in one outfield. Beto Avila, Orlando Cepeda, the son of El Perucho, who was never able to play, actually ended up having a Hall of Fame career with the San Francisco Giants and the St. Louis Cardinals. And Roberto Clemente. Roberto Clemente is one of the most famous Latin baseball players, and he was immortalized by his acts because he ended up dying in a plane crash when he went on a mission of goodwill to Nicaragua after an earthquake ravaged Nicaragua, in which over 25,000 people died. He was not only a hero to his native Puerto Rico and the fans of the Pittsburgh Pirates, but he also became a hero for Latin Americans and Nicaraguans. Some of the players from the modern era, or the most recent era, people who I can actually remember playing, are Fernando Valenzuela, who caused what they called Fernando Mania, when on the nights he pitched in his rookie season, all Chicano and Latino fans in the Los Angeles area flocked to Dodger Stadium, and basically it became one big Mexican party at Chavez Ravine. He triggered waves of national pride, and we heard about the corridos earlier. There's actually a corrido about Fernando Valenzuela in Mexico. Another is Sammy Sosa. Everybody's familiar with Sammy Sosa. He's one of the players who actually erased the concept of good field, no hit, which was a discriminatory stereotype against Latin ball players because they were said to not be able to hit. They were just considered slick infielders. And one of the newest players to come into the league is Miguel Cabrera of the Florida Marlins. Because Latin baseball players were originally from the aristocracy and from the white race group, when the door was open to players of color, it actually became a way that people in impoverished nations could escape poverty. So they were able to leave their impoverished nations and make $11 million in a season. Another interesting note is Cuba. Cuba is pretty much was the hotbed of baseball in Latin America until the blockade or the embargo started as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Fidel Castro is a renowned, I'm sorry I had to mention him, Maria. Fidel Castro is a renowned baseball fan. He actually banned professional baseball after the Cuban Revolution, and one of the byproducts of that is that Jose Contreras and the Hernandez brothers and other players from Cuba are forced to abandon their homes if they want to play professional baseball with the chance to have the same success as other Latinos. Mexico, Venezuela, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico this year participated in the Caribbean World Series, or the Caribbean Series. It actually started in 1949 and was piloted by Cuba. Panama at times has participated, as well as Colombia. This year it took place in Matanzas, or Mazatlan. Why did I say Matanzas? That's right. No, it took place in Mazatlan, and it actually serves as a kind of way to put on exhibition Latin cultures. And as you can see in this picture, during the opening ceremonies, Mexican culture was put on exhibition. And it also serves as a way to exhibit national pride. Fans from all across what they call the Caribbean took place in Mazatlan, in Mexico, on the Pacific. But they call it the Caribbean. Mexico has access to the Caribbean, so we can forgive that.
We're getting bigger.
Yes. Mexico won this year's Caribbean Series, and since it was hosted there, it kind of ignited a fervor in Mazatlan. One other thing that kind of happens within baseball in Latin America is that because these players are coming out of impoverished nations and making exorbitant amounts of money, they're subject to victimization. Last year, right after the baseball season in the major leagues ended, Ugueth Urbina, a Venezuelan closer, his mother was kidnapped and held for ransom. They demanded $3 million from Ugueth Urbina, and they actually showed up at her house dressed as police officers, kidnapped her and took her to Colombia, and held her on the property of a drug lord. In conclusion, yeah. She was recovered, just so everybody knows, and they didn't have to pay anything. In conclusion, Latin American baseball and North America and the way they play in North America kind of serves as a way for us to reflect on the history of baseball, because it's a product of Cuban influence, of U.S. occupation, and it reflects themes that run throughout Latin American history, like corruption and victimization. Bibliography, and if anybody has any questions, I'm open.
Hey, Mike. The other day I was driving to school, and on the radio, there was this question, and I'm going to ask you if you can answer that.
I'll try.
Listening to the question, they say, in what place or which sport is the most popular in the United States? So, and I kind of came up with my own, and I was told
In the United States?
in the United States, which sport attracts the most people, is most popular?
Traditionally here what happens is we characterize what's most popular on television, because television and advertising pay the bills. But the San Francisco Giants alone every year attract over 3 million fans to a game, and the popularity of the game is reflected in a different way. It's listened to on the radio, and since it's a pastoral game, it's seen in a different way. It takes a little bit more of a dedication as a fan to be into baseball, because they play 162 games in a regular season, and they have spring training, and they have a postseason that can last as long as another 30 games. So here in the United States, you could say that football is probably the most popular, because it's easier for it to be popular.
I was the same way. Guess what? Daytona Beach car racing #1 and baseball.
Right. So that's actually gotten to a point where the national sport of America probably isn't baseball, but in Venezuela, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, it's definitely the national sport. And in Mexico and Nicaragua and Panama and Colombia, it's shared with soccer. Go ahead. He was born in New York, but he learned to play baseball in the Dominican Republic. Yeah, there's actually a lot of Latino players in the United States now who are playing and they have roots in Mexico, like Fernando Valenzuela, who grew up in Sacramento. Yeah, before baseball was desegregated. Yeah. Oh. If if you want one more little anecdote, after September 11th, 2001, a lot of baseball players go home to the Caribbean during the winter, and they were at home, and players like Rafael Furcal and several others who left at 20, 21 years old came back and suddenly were 24 or 25 years old because they had to come back with official documented birth certificates. So. Anybody else? Fernando?
Well, this ends our Capstone